He found a broken dog on a stormy night. The ending will warm your heart. The wind howled through the empty streets of Crestwood, a quiet little town where most houses had their lights turned off by 9 p.m. Rain drizzles lightly, creating tiny ripples in the puddles on the sidewalk. The town slept peacefully, but Jake Carter did not. Sitting in his dimly lit garage, Jake ran his rough hands over a small metal badge, his old firefighter's emblem. It had been 6 months since the fire. 6 months since he stood in front of the burning house, screaming, kicking, doing everything he could to get inside. 6 months since he failed. A mother and her 2 kids had died that night. No matter what anyone said, no matter how many people told him he did all he couldn't forgive himself. Now he just existed. He fixed cars in his garage, barely spoke to his neighbors, and lived off frozen dinners and black coffee. His once bright blue eyes were dull, carrying the weight of guilt and sleepless nights. That night, as the rain picked up, Jake heard something, a whimper, faint but definitely there. He frowned and stood up, walking toward the sound. The wind slapped against his face as he stepped outside. There, near his garage door, lay a dog. At first, he thought it was just a pile of wet fur, but then it moved. The dog lifted its head slightly, its eyes dark, terrified, meeting Jake's for just a second before looking away. It was a medium-sized mutt, ribs showing through its thin coat, fur matted with dirt. One of its front legs looked swollen, the paw barely touching the ground. Jake sighed. "Just great," he muttered. He had no business taking in a dog. He couldn't even take care of himself. He should just call animal control. Let someone else deal with it. But then he took a closer look. The dog wasn't just wet and dirty, it was broken. Its ears flattened against its head. Its whole body trembled. And the worst part? It didn't even try to run. Most strays bolted at the sight of a human. But this one? It just lay there, as if it had given up. Jake exhaled sharply. "Damn it," he muttered, running a hand through his messy brown hair. He crouched down, moving slowly. "Hey, buddy," he said, his voice softer than he'd used in months. "You're in bad shape." The dog didn't respond. It just blinked, tired and lifeless. For a second, something inside Jake twisted. That look, that empty, hopeless stare. He had seen it before, in the mirror. Jake stood up and walked inside the garage. A minute later, he came back with an old towel. "All right, don't bite me," he warned, kneeling down. Carefully, he draped the towel over the dog and lifted it into his arms. The dog flinched at the sudden movement, a weak, painful whimper escaping its throat. But it didn't fight. Jake swallowed the lump in his throat. No dog should be this used to pain. Inside his house, Jake placed the dog on an old blanket near the heater. The dog curled into itself, shivering from cold, fear, or both. "Not much of a fighter, huh?" Jake murmured. He grabbed a can of tuna from his kitchen and placed it in front of the dog. It sniffed but didn't move. "Come on, eat," Jake said, nudging the plate slightly. Nothing. He sighed. This was a bad idea. The dog needed a vet, real care, not some broken man with his own baggage. He went to his small bathroom and filled a bowl with warm water. As he returned, he saw the dog watching him. Not moving, just watching. "You're not much of a talker," Jake muttered. "That makes 2 of us." He dipped a cloth in the warm water and carefully dabbed at the wound on the dog's leg. It wasn't fresh, but it was swollen and looked painful. The dog whimpered but didn't move away. "Someone did a number on you, huh?" Jake whispered, noticing old scars on the dog's back. He had seen these kinds of marks before, on dogs that had been beaten, neglected, or worse. His jaw clenched. Who could hurt something so defenseless? After cleaning the wound as best as he could, Jake sat back, rubbing his tired face. "I can't believe I'm doing this," he muttered to himself. The dog was still watching him, those dark eyes unreadable. "Fine. You can stay for the night," Jake said, "but tomorrow I'm taking you to a shelter." He wasn't keeping a dog. No way! Jake switched off the light and lay down on the couch, pulling an old blanket over himself. The rain still patterned against the window. The heater hummed softly. Then just as he was drifting off, he heard something. A soft, shuffling sound. He opened his eyes. The dog had moved. It had crawled, slowly, carefully until it was just a foot away from the couch. Then with a heavy sigh, it rested its head on the floor. Jake started. His chest felt tight, like something heavy had settled there. He had spent 6 months drowning in his own pain, pushing people away, refusing help, thinking he was beyond saving. And now here was this dog, scared, hurt. Yet despite everything, it had crawled closer. Jake swallowed the lump in his throat. He reached out, hesitating for a second, then gently placed his hand on the dog's head. The dog flinched, but didn't pull away. "Yeah," Jake whispered, barely audible. "I know the feeling." For the first time in a long time, Jake didn't feel completely alone, and neither did the dog.
The morning light filtered through the half-closed blinds, casting golden streaks across the wooden floor. The air inside Jake's house was quiet, except for the soft hum of the heater and the occasional rustling of fabric as he stirred awake on the couch. His muscles were stiff, his neck sore from sleeping in an awkward position. With a low groan, he sat up, rubbing his eyes. Then he remembered. The dog. He looked down. The stray, still wrapped in the old towel, was lying just a few feet away, curled up in a tight ball. But this time, its eyes weren't completely shut. They were barely open, watching him cautiously. "You're still here," Jake muttered, surprised. Most strays would have bolted the moment they got a chance, but this one hadn't. Slowly, Jake moved off the couch, careful not to startle the dog. The animal flinched slightly, but didn't pull away. That was progress, right? Jake exhaled and stood up, stretching his sore limbs. "All right, buddy. Let's figure out what to do with you." The dog didn't react. Jake went to the kitchen and opened a can of dog food he'd found buried in his pantry, probably something he bought years ago when his neighbor's dog used to visit. He poured it into a bowl and placed it on the floor. Then he stepped back. The dog didn't move. Jake frowned. "Come on, you've got to be hungry." Nothing. For a few minutes, Jake just stood there, arms crossed, watching. The dog only stared at the bowl but didn't make a move toward it. With a sigh, Jake walked over to the couch and sat down, deciding to ignore the dog completely. He turned on the TV, flipping through channels. He wasn't really paying attention, but after a few minutes, he heard it. Soft shuffle. Carefully, without making any sudden movements, Jake glanced to the side. The dog had crawled forward, inch by inch, sniffing at the bowl. Then, as if expecting the food to disappear at any moment, it started eating, fast, desperate, gulping it down in huge bites. Jake swallowed hard. This dog wasn't just hungry, it was starving. Had it been living off scraps? Had it ever known what it was like to have a full meal? He didn't know why, but watching the dog devour the food like it was its last meal made his chest ache. Jake leaned back on the couch, running a hand through his messy hair. "Guess I should call you something," he muttered. The dog paused mid-bite, glancing at him. Jake smirked. "Oh, now you're listening?" He studied the dog, thin, beaten, and quiet. A ghost of what it was supposed to be. "Max," he said, testing the name out loud. The dog didn't react. Jake shrugged. "Yeah, Max sounds good." For a while, Max simply stared at him, as if trying to understand something. Then, without a sound, he went back to eating. Jake didn't know it yet, but something had already changed. Building trust, one quiet moment at a time. Over the next few days, Jake kept telling himself that he was not keeping the dog. But every morning when he woke up, Max was still there. He tried calling the local shelters, but they were either full or unwilling to take in a dog with visible injuries. Too much work, they said. Too much trauma. Jake knew that feeling. So he let Max stay, just for a while. At first, Max barely moved from his spot. He still flinched at sudden noises. He never barked, never wagged his tail. But he was watching Jake, always watching. Whenever Jake sat down to drink his morning coffee, Max would inch a little closer, as if testing how much space he was allowed to take. Whenever Jake worked on a car in his garage, Max would sit near the door, just watching, waiting. And one night, when Jake left the front door slightly open for fresh air, he found Max still inside, choosing to stay instead of running away. One evening, Jake sat on the couch, flipping through an old photo album. His fingers hesitated over a picture of himself in his firefighter uniform. It felt like another lifetime. A low sigh escaped his lips. Then he felt it. Something nudged his knee. Slowly, Jake looked down. Max was there, sitting right in front of him. For the first time, he had moved on his own, not to eat, not to escape, just to be near Jake. Jake's throat tightened. "Hey, buddy," he murmured. Hesitantly, carefully, he reached out. His hand hovered over Max's head for a moment before finally making contact. Max flinched, but didn't pull away. For a few seconds, Jake just let his hand rest there, feeling the rough, matted fur beneath his fingers. It was the first time Max had let himself be touched. Jake didn't say anything. He just sat there, petting the dog in silence. And Max stayed. But progress wasn't always easy. A few days later, Jake went out to buy dog food. He wasn't gone long, maybe 30 minutes. When he came back, he found Max hiding under the table, shaking violently. Jake's stomach dropped. "What the hell happened?" he muttered. Then he saw it. His neighbor's garbage truck backing away from the street. Max must have heard the loud noises, the beeping, the clattering of bins, and it sent him back to whatever hell he came from. Jake crouched down, his voice soft. "Hey, Max, it's okay, it's just me." But Max's body was frozen. His eyes were wide, filled with that same haunted fear. Jake clenched his fists. Whoever had hurt this dog before, they had left deep wounds, and it was going to take more than just food and a warm house to heal them. That night, as Max curled up beside the couch, Jake lay awake. He had spent months pushing people away, telling himself he didn't deserve kindness. But Max had spent his whole life believing the same thing. Jake glanced at the dog, at the way his small body barely took up any space. "Guess we're both a little broken, huh?" he muttered. Max didn't answer, but for the first time, his tail gave the tiniest, most hesitant wag. Jake smiled. "All right," he whispered, "I won't give up on you." Max exhaled softly and for the first time, fell asleep without fear. Jake wasn't sure who was saving who anymore, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. The morning sun filtered through the window, casting a warm glow over the wooden floor. The house felt different now, less empty, less hollow. There were still bad days, still long nights where Jake would sit awake, staring at the ceiling, lost in the memories of the fire. But now, there were also good days. Days where Max followed him from room to room, no longer afraid to exist. Days where the dog ate his food without hesitation. Evenings where Jake sat on the couch watching TV and Max curled up just a few feet away, his dark eyes finally at peace. It wasn't perfect. Max still flinched at loud noises. He still froze whenever a stranger walked by the house. But Jake had learned to be patient. Healing wasn't a straight road. It was a slow climb, full of slips and falls. And then one day, they fell hard. A moment of fear. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. The air was crisp, the sky an endless blue. For the first time since Jake had taken Max in, he decided to take him for a walk beyond the backyard. Max had never been on a leash before. At first, he refused to move, his tail tucked tightly between his legs. But Jake knelt down, gently scratching behind Max's ears. "It's okay, buddy," he murmured. "Just a walk. No cages, no chains, just you and me." After a few minutes, Max hesitantly took a step forward, then another. It was slow at first, but soon they were moving down the quiet street together, Max sticking close to Jake's side but walking nonetheless. Jake smiled to himself. Progress. Then it happened. A car backfired in the distance, a loud, sharp bang. Max's body snapped stiff. His ears flattened, his entire frame trembled. Jake barely had time to react before Max ripped free from the leash and bolted. "Max, no!" Jake's heart slammed against his ribs as he ran after him. Max wasn't just running, he was fleeing, driven purely by terror. He darted between cars, sprinting down the road. Jake chased him, lungs burning, but Max was fast, too fast. Then, just as Max dashed across the road, a truck turned the corner. Time slowed. The truck's horn blared, tires screeching against the pavement. Jake's breath caught in his throat. "Max!" And then, Max skidded to a stop, just inches from disaster. The truck rumbled past, its driver yelling something out the window, but Jake didn't hear it. He was already sprinting forward. Max had collapsed on the sidewalk, his body shaking violently. His paws were scraped from the rough pavement, his eyes wide with panic. Jake dropped to his knees beside him, hands shaking. "Jesus, Max," he breathed, his voice raw. "What the hell were you thinking?" Max didn't respond. He just pressed his head against Jake's chest, his whole body trembling uncontrollably. Jake let out a shaky breath. He wrapped his arms around the dog, holding him tight. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're okay." Max whimpered, pressing closer. For the first time since Jake had found him, Max wasn't running away from him. He was running to him. After that day, Max wouldn't leave Jake's side. Everywhere Jake went, Max followed. His little shadow, always watching, always needing to be close. But not everyone understood. The next morning, as Jake was fixing up an old truck in his garage, he heard a voice behind him. Jake. He turned to see Mrs. Holloway, his next-door neighbor. She was in her early 60s, always dressed in neat cardigans, always watering her flowers at exactly 8 a.m. Jake wiped his hands on his jeans. Morning. She folded her arms, glancing at Max, who was lying beside Jake's feet. That dog of yours caused quite a scene yesterday. Jake's stomach tightened. Yeah, he got spooked. It won't happen again. Mrs. Holloway's gaze softened, just a little. I know you're trying, Jake, but some folks around here, they don't trust dogs like that. Jake frowned. Dogs like what? Scared ones, she said simply. A scared dog can turn dangerous fast. People talk, you know. If they think he's a threat, they might call animal control. Jake's chest went cold. He's not dangerous, he said firmly. Mrs. Holloway sighed. I'm just telling you what I heard. Be careful, Jake. She turned and walked away, leaving Jake standing there, fists clenched. Max, oblivious, nudged Jake's leg, as if sensing his tension. Jake exhaled, running a hand over his face. No one was taking Max from him, not after everything they'd been through. That night, as Jake lay on the couch, he felt something warm press against his side. Max. It was the first time Max had gotten this close on his own. Jake stayed still, not wanting to startle him. But after a few moments, he reached out, slow, careful, and placed his hand on Max's back. Max didn't flinch. Jake swallowed hard. He had spent so long believing he was beyond saving. But maybe, saving someone else was the answer all along. He scratched behind Max's ears, voice barely above a whisper. You're not going anywhere, buddy. Max exhaled softly, resting his head against Jake's chest. For the first time, Jake felt something he hadn't in years. Peace? But life had one more test for them. The next morning, Jake woke up to loud voices outside. He rushed to the window and his stomach dropped. Two men in uniform stood near Mrs. Holloway's porch, talking. Animal control. Jake's hands curled into fists. He wasn't losing Max. Not now. Not ever. He took a deep breath and stepped outside. The men turned. One of them, a tall guy with a clipboard, spoke first. Morning got a report about a dangerous stray in the area. Jake's jaw tightened. He glanced at Mrs. Holloway, who avoided his gaze. He's not dangerous, Jake said. The man shrugged. Mind if we take a look? Jake stood his ground. Yeah, I do mind. The tension was thick. Then Max walked up beside Jake, pressing against his leg. Jake looked down. Max's tail was wagging, just slightly, but enough to prove that he was not the same terrified dog from before. The officer hesitated, then sighed. We'll be watching, Carter. With that, they left. Jake exhaled, his hands shaking. He looked down at Max, scratching behind his ears. Guess we're stuck together, huh? Max licked his hand. Jake smiled, and for the first time in a long, long time, he knew he wasn't alone anymore. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass, and a soft breeze whispered through the trees. It was the kind of peaceful morning Jake had never really paid attention to before. But today, he noticed. Max walked beside him, leash loose in Jake's hand. His paws moved over the sidewalk with quiet confidence. The dog who once flinched at every sound now held his head a little higher. Jake glanced down. Not bad, huh? Max looked up, ears perked, his tail wagging slightly. It had been 3 months since Jake found Max outside his garage, broken and terrified. 3 months of learning, patience, and trust. And now, Max was home. Jake had never been the kind of guy who took walks for fun. But now, every morning, he and Max followed the same path, down the street, past the corner store, and into the small, dog-friendly park. At first, Max had been hesitant, staying close to Jake's legs, watching the other dogs from a distance. But today was different. Jake stopped near a shady spot by a bench, letting Max observe. Across the field, a golden retriever puppy was chasing a ball, its happy barks filling the air. Jake crouched down next to Max. What do you think? Max's tail flicked uncertainly. He took a step forward, then another. Jake didn't push. He let Max decide. And after a long pause, Max did something he'd never done before. He trotted forward on his own, nose twitching as he cautiously approached the golden retriever. Jake watched, heart pounding. The retriever spotted Max and bounded over, tail wagging. Max froze for a second, but then, slowly, his own tail gave a cautious wag in return. Jake held his breath. Then, Max lowered his front paws in a playful bow. Jake exhaled, a slow, relieved chuckle escaping his lips. "Attaboy," he murmured. For the first time, Max was playing. Days passed, turning into weeks. The morning walks became longer. Max's posture became more confident. He ate without hesitation now. He wagged his tail more often than not. But more than anything, Jake noticed that Max started seeking out affection. At first, it was small things, like sitting closer to Jake's feet when he worked in the garage. Then, one evening, as Jake was watching TV, Max jumped onto the couch beside him. Jake looked down, startled. Max met his eyes, then rested his head on Jake's leg, sighing softly. Jake swallowed the lump in his throat. He lifted his hand and scratched behind Max's ears. No flinching, no hesitation, just trust. It was a Tuesday when Jake saw the fire, not a real one. Just a controlled burn, something the fire department did on an abandoned lot to train new recruits. But the moment he smelled the smoke, his chest tightened. He stopped walking. Max, always alert to Jake's moods, paused too. Jake's hands curled into fists. His heart pounded. He could still hear it, the screams, the crackling wood, the suffocating heat. For 6 months, he had avoided fire at all costs, and yet here he was, frozen in place. Then, he felt something warm against his hand. Max. He had pressed his nose into Jake's palm, grounding him. Jake took a slow, shaky breath. He crouched down, burying his fingers into Max's fur. "You feel that, buddy," he murmured. "That's how you help me." Max licked Jake's wrist. Jake laughed. Really laughed. For the first time, the fire didn't own him. One evening, there was a knock at Jake's door. He opened it to find Mrs. Holloway. She stood on the porch, her hands clasped, her eyes softer than usual. Jake raised an eyebrow. "What's up?" She hesitated. Then, glancing behind him at Max, she said, "I was wrong about him." Jake blinked. "I've seen you two," she continued. "Every morning, every night. You were right, Jake. He's not dangerous. He just needed someone to believe in him." Jake looked down at Max, who was sitting calmly beside him. "He's a good dog," Jake said simply. Mrs. Holloway smiled. "I can see that now." She shifted awkwardly. I made some peanut butter dog biscuits. Thought maybe he'd like them." Jake stared at her, stunned. Max, however, had already made up his mind. He walked right up to Mrs. Holloway, tail wagging. For the first time, he trusted a stranger. Jake swallowed past the lump in his throat and stepped aside. Months passed, the seasons changed, and then, one cold December night, something happened. A storm rolled in, harsh wind, heavy rain, thunder. Jake was asleep when the first crack of lightning hit. He jolted awake, his breath sharp. Max was already at the foot of the bed, body tense. Jake reached out. "It's just a storm, buddy." But Max wasn't afraid. He wasn't shaking like before. He wasn't hiding under furniture. Instead, Max stepped forward and pressed against Jake's side. Jake stared. Then, as another boom of thunder rattled the windows, Max did something Jake never expected. He licked Jake's cheek, a simple gesture. But Jake understood exactly what it meant. "You were there for me when I was scared. Now I'm here for you." Jake buried his face into Max's fur, his chest aching in the best way possible. "Yeah, buddy," he whispered. "I know." They had saved each other. Jake didn't know what came next. Maybe he'd go back to work. Maybe he wouldn't. Maybe life would throw another storm his way. But one thing was certain. He wouldn't face it alone. Max was family. And for the first time in a long, long time, Jake finally felt like he was home too.